Hello, PerfBytes listeners. Before we begin, please take a moment to listen to a word from our sponsors.
Whether you want to load test your APIs or your browser-based applications, you need to be able to easily scale up volume and identify problem areas. SmartBear has you covered. LoadUI is the rock star of API load testing. Using an intuitive, versatile design, LoadUI gives you the power to scale up and out, letting you dial up high volume and real-world load from any number of local and remote computers, all within a single test environment. With LoadUI, it's easy to create and configure tests, incorporating all of your operating system, application, and database statistics agentlessly. It's fully interactive, too, so you can easily modify your tests and fix errors on the fly. Load Complete is an astonishingly easy-to-use load testing tool for HTML, AJAX, and rich internet applications. Create and run automated load tests in just minutes using a browser to naturally record your interactions with the website or application. You can scale up the number of virtual users, pull in data from Excel or other data sources, monitor server resources during test execution, and even distribute your test geographically. Load Complete's reports and charts make it a breeze to explore aspects of how your site or app performs under pressure and ultimately pinpoint performance issues proactively. LoadUI and Load Complete by SmartBear ensure outstanding performance across your entire web stack.
It's time for PerfBytes.
What the is PerfBytes? The fourth square meal of the day. Don't bogart the PerfBytes. Waffles. Microwave ready. Blah-blah-blah. Blah-blah-blah. Add nutritional value to your brain. It's time for PerfBytes with your hosts Mark Tomlinson, James Pulley, and Howard Chorney. PerfBytes.
Whatever.
Hey, it's time for PerfBytes. Greetings, PerfBytes listeners and the PerfBytes legions of performance gurus on planet Earth, with your faithfully ambiguous hosts, Howard Chorney, James Pulley, and Mark Tomlinson here. And with our today's special guest attending the PerfBytes Pancake Extravaganza with the Chorney at the Chorney residence in Framingham, surrounded by 200 feet of snow, it's Andreas Grabner from DynaTrace. Andi, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for letting me actually be part of the show. And actually, we already enjoyed the pancakes and the bacon, I have to say. Really delicious.
Really delicious bacon. Now, Howard, where did you get this bacon?
I got the bacon at the food hall from the deli counter.
That's from the deli counter.
Yes.
What was interesting yesterday, Howard, when you asked me, are you okay with bacon? I reminded you that I'm from Austria, and bacon is basically, that's our whole diet is based on bacon. So delicious.
What a wonderful food staple, too, I must say.
I have to say, Howard, the one thing we do miss out, in the wintertime is that you're also an avid barbecue, like a good performance engineer. You do barbecue. So you actually have a smoker and the whole thing at the house, right?
Yes, I do.
Oh,
I'm just waiting for some snow to clear out so I can go smoke out a couple racks of ribs.
That's good. You could do smoked bacon, couldn't you?
I probably could. I smoke many pork products out on the smoker, I will say.
I think that'd be really good. Well, I'm pretty excited about this PerfBytes episode with you, Andi, because it covers a topic that we have never specifically gone in depth, and this is something that I know you've crawled in a lot, and that is SharePoint performance.
Ooh.
Exactly. And you had written several blog entries, but recently a blog entry that we're going to kind of share some of the points from the DynaTrace blog on Sharepoint. So maybe give a little background about how do you keep getting called in to do this kind of work on SharePoint with DynaTrace?
Well, I'm not sure how many people know DynaTrace, but we are an application performance management or monitoring company. I know, Mark, you said APM is kind of a term that has been misused too much in the recent history. We are all about performance, but performance not from necessarily a breaking the app perspective, even though we do have a load testing service as well. But from a DynaTrace perspective, where I come from, my background, we sit in the application and try to figure out why things are slow. And just throwing more hardware to the system is a way to solve performance problems, right? Or it's like eating more pills if you're sick instead of trying to find the root cause, like eating better bacon. So we get called a lot by companies that have issues with their applications, and then fortunately in my case I've been working in performance for 15 years now, and I consider myself kind of a little bit of an expert, fortunately, because I can work on these things day to day. And what's interesting, and this is true for any type of application, we always see certain similar problem patterns
Yeah.
as being the root cause of all type of application problems that are out there. And that's also true for SharePoint. I think later on we'll dig a little bit more into this. But from a SharePoint perspective, I think we see one big issue is SharePoint adoption. So when people decide on SharePoint that they are deploying it and they want obviously their employees or whoever's going to use it make use of it, we see that SharePoint adoption and the confidence in SharePoint in the last years kind of dropped.
Yeah. Why would that be, Andy?
Why would that be? So I think, part of it and a big part is performance. Because if you're working with a software, right, the Google effect or whatever you want to call it, and if you are using SharePoint as a collaboration platform and you cannot collaborate in the way, in the speed and the velocity that you need to get your job done, then you're frustrated and then you find alternatives.
Yeah.
I think that's a big topic.
Yeah, and I think if there surprisingly, some people may not be familiar with SharePoint. There could be a lot of young engineers that just came in to listen to the show in the last few years. SharePoint goes back quite a long ways in the Microsoft history. And like you say, it started out as kind of straightforward document sharing collaboration portal that a lot of folks would first out just start on premise. It's on the intranet. I remember a lot of customers would just install it like on a desktop, on a PC, sitting running under someone's desk. And then it evolved to really running much larger content as, it really took off, and SharePoint just took off across an enterprise all over the place. So as it grew and grew, both in usage as well as capability, it got sucked into doing other roles beyond document management. They started putting in things like the Microsoft, the Office server system, MOS stuff, or SharePoint systems. The workflow got in the back, and they have these things called web parts, which are like, portal plugins. And all sorts of vendors jumped on building these really cool kind of web parts, including even other Microsoft roles from SQL Server reporting services, the Visual Studio team. Everyone started jumping on top of SharePoint as a platform. So as the usage went up, so did the complexity of everything that was being run. To add insult to injury, they start putting Ajax front ends on it and start putting Silverlight embedded in it. And suddenly, Andy, SharePoint performance it just drops off like it hits this brick wall going 100 miles an hour just within the last few years.
So personally, Mark, I think my first foray into SharePoint was probably around 2007, 2008 timeframe, where we were just using it for a document management collaboration system. And I didn't see a lot of performance issues when we were using it. It's basically we'd upload a doc, we could share it, we could edit it, and that was about it. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting that it's really morphed over the past few years.
Well, Andy, I know you're in your role as an evangelist or with DynaTrace, but Andy, I think you had some numbers from Forrester recently.
Yeah, they recently shared it with us. So what's interesting, and Howard, I think as you said, you had your first experience in 2007. A lot of people are still on SharePoint 2007. 22%, there was a survey going on last year. 71% are still on SharePoint 2010. Which is the largest portion of it, even though SharePoint 2013 has been out for a while. But it seems that people are not really moving away from 2010 because it seems the upgrade process is pretty hard because there's been a certain change in architecture. And so that's why we still have a lot of people on these old platforms. And also, over the years, the more content you add, the more it became obvious that there's a fundamental problem with SharePoint, and that's the underlying architecture. Because when SharePoint was initially brought on by Microsoft, I don't remember the company that they acquired back then and what the initial product was called. Yeah. But the fundamental problem in the SharePoint architecture is that from a list management perspective and also document information that you upload all ends up in a single database table. So if you're installing on your local machine and you use it with your 2-3 colleagues to share certain documents, not a big issue. But if big enterprises adopting it and you're now sharing more data than we ever shared before, so you have thousands of documents, you have millions of rows in your lists, that's becoming a problem because everything ends up in a single table.
So it's pretty single-threaded when you're trying to access it. And if you if you're across an enterprise with thousands and thousands and thousands of users, that certainly would cause serious issues.
Exactly, that's the problem. Yeah, and the problem here is really in the underlying architecture. And I guess it became hugely popular back then. And I guess nobody ever thought that it's that popular. I guess Microsoft hoped that it's becoming that popular, but they never thought it's about time to change the architecture because they would have not need to redo it.
Yeah.
And it's so yeah, but kind of finishing up the numbers. So there's a lot of people who are still on the older versions. And what was also interesting in that study, they asked IT and business on what they think of their SharePoint usage. Is it helpful? What's their expectations? Does it meet their expectations? And these numbers dropped significantly. So the ROI from IT and business, the average number dropped from 79% to about 65% in the last 3 years. And I think part of it is also, if you think about when you share a document these days, what do you do? If you don't have SharePoint available, if you are not happy with it, go to services like Dropbox or Google Docs, where it's easy, accessible, and these things have been optimized for exactly that use case.
Yeah.
Sharing things across the globe in a very fast way. Yeah. And I think that's why we saw a huge drop in acceptance of SharePoint, because SharePoint really did not adapt and kind of didn't keep up with what other services provide from a usability perspective and performance perspective.
Well, that's kind of too bad because, SharePoint, again, using it back in 2007 was sort of a great standard. I mean, it was pretty cool to be able to do that, share docs the way we could back then. I know it's funny, we talk about 2007 like it's ancient history or something like that, but still, really want to understand what are some of the big differences between 2010 and 2013 that have sort of halted the adoption of the upgrade path.
I think that the from what Andy's illustrating, it really does draw a line to, I'm just going to keep adding and adding and adding on this old platform without re-architecting. I remember a time back in Microsoft when we worked there. Actually, Andy, you and I met there years ago, and looking at this thing called WinFS, which is a Windows file system, and I was working in the Windows Server team in the EEC, and then also spent some time working very closely with SQL Server. And there was always an argument about this content database and the way it was default installed by the Sharepoint team. And there were countless load tests and countless evidence, and the two groups never got along well. And even the Sharepoint team was like, for our customers, we don't need to follow all of the super high scalability SQL Server best practices. And that just sort of led people down a path of this single content database, and even the data files of that single content database were never installed properly according to the good practices that the SQL Server team would suggest. And I know there's lots of tips just from the SQL Server perspective that we'll talk about, Andy, but it's clear to me that if you're a tester and you're getting pulled in, hey, our performance on SharePoint is running slow, it's since the platform has become so complex, even between 2007, 2010, Howard, that jumps now to 2013, and now you have Office 365, which is implementing most of the SharePoint capability in the cloud. The idea that that complexity is there, there's so many moving parts that could be the one performance bottleneck, or it now is a collection of 14 different bottlenecks caused by the varying and diverse implementations of what's running on top of SharePoint. So that's my warning to the listeners. If you're getting pulled in to do SharePoint performance, if you start designing a test with, I'm just going to throw some things at the home page, or I'm going to do a document upload, a document open, and a document save in the old paradigm of SharePoint, but you're not looking at exercising the workflow, exercising custom web parts, exercising the Ajax front end, looking at Visual Studio running on top of SharePoint, looking at reporting services components interacting. SharePoint as a platform is so complex. Your usage profile and your target requirements for performance in SharePoint, that profile looks huge, and it can be a quagmire. When most people would say, well, start first with what is the slowest thing you're observing in SharePoint as you put your plan together, and hopefully you're targeting the thing that most people are experiencing in SharePoint as being really, really slow. I think, Howard, moving to 2013, there are some improvements from an infrastructure standpoint in terms of .NET and the .NET components that are more scalable generally underneath 2013 as opposed to 2010. And I'm not as familiar with the SQL Server implementations, because I think with 2013 you can at least run on Katmai, which had some other improvements from a SQL Server engine that benefit things as well.
Hey, Mark, if we could just step back too, as we're talking about testing SharePoint site, SharePoint rollout.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the web parts. So my understanding from today, talking to Andi, are, web parts could be, there are a lot of third-party web parts out there that weren't necessarily designed by Microsoft that plug in. And I think that could really exacerbate a lot of the site performance issues that are going to happen. Yeah. Because who knows how many, underlying calls those web parts, the third-party developers have made. And, I think that adds a lot of mystery, just like testing over a network, right? Because maybe these web parts are doing third-party call-outs over the web or something like that. Andi, is that
that's exactly right. And the thing is, Microsoft made it very easy that you design your pages and put as many web parts as you want on it. And some of them look really sexy, and they deliver what you want. Mm-hmm. But if you put like 2, 3, 5 web parts on it, as you said, from third parties, and you have no clue what they're doing, they look shiny and great on your local machine. But once they go against a real database, and then they make 1,000 web service calls in the backend, or maybe download additional JavaScript files and making calls, this is the problem, right? Mm-hmm. You have a fundamental architectural issue in SharePoint, I think, and on top of it, Microsoft made it easy, which is great, to put additional components on it. But the more stuff you put on it, like a Lego house, right? You build a tower, and if you have faulty parts all over, then it's just, it's very. So you bring up the perfect point here. Web parts are a great vehicle in SharePoint to extend its capabilities and to make it more flexible. But especially as a tester, but also as a developer, you need to make sure that you build your web parts with performance and scalability, especially in mind.
Has Microsoft introduced any standards on how these web parts should
No, web part is really, at the end, what the web part is doing, at the end, the web part provides an HTML-based interface to the end user. But the thing is, your web part could be 1 out of 20 on a page. It can be one on its own, but people should just follow best practices. But I think this is true for any type of software engineering. If something becomes very popular and easy to build, just as mobile applications, everybody nowadays can build a mobile application with all the tools and the wizards that are out there, mm-hmm. but not necessarily are you building a great architected and performance-wise product. But you may have a great idea and it's implemented, it looks sexy and nice, as I said before, but underneath the hood, it might be totally ugly.
Well, on that point, Andi, as I remember working at Microsoft, and if I were an ISV and I were going to build a piece of software that integrated with any Microsoft product, particularly SharePoint in this case, at Microsoft, we do a great job of sort of listing the basics of how to use an API. And we're, by documentation back in that day, we had to publish every API that we could come up with. And the issue was more like, if you're an ISV, here's the API you use, let's say to access the workflow engine that's running in SharePoint, or specific components on the back end of SharePoint's API that do storage and list management and all these other components, all the other tables. Or let's say you want to do some custom data storage into the content database. You might have to roll your own content database on the side or things like that. The issue is to find the one person in the SharePoint team that knows all of the performance implication or resource usage behind an API that they publish. That's really, really hard. Even the people inside Microsoft that you might work with as a vendor, you read the documentation, you build against that API, but even knowing that it's abusing some contention in the content database or it's allocating memory differently behind the API, that's where the real challenge comes as an ISV, let alone just being a customer consumer of these web parts and having no idea why the SharePoint platform APIs are so slow.
Yeah. And I think that's also, I think later in this discussion, we were getting into some of the technical details, but kind of to bring it out there, if you are a developer on SharePoint, please make sure that you do your analysis and look what's going on behind the scenes. I think I wrote a couple of blogs years ago on like SharePoint 2007 and 2010, where I basically highlighted what's really going on in the SharePoint API when you, for instance, access data in the content database. And it's shocking if you use the standard APIs based on the samples that are out there. So you really want to make sure to use it in an optimized way. And I brought some examples there. But yeah, I think the advice that I want to give right away, if you're a developer, make sure don't use your frameworks blindly and your APIs blindly, but make sure they're optimized on your usage.
Well, and not to give a shame, this is not shameless, but part of the reason we love having it on the show from a DynaTrace perspective is the sort of the X-ray vision that a DynaTrace can give you into .NET in the app server itself. That allows you to see, well, hey, Microsoft, I call your API, but now I can see all the backend methods.
Exactly,
even you're doing things, and you know.
You can see all the dirty laundry. That's what it is.
So let's we're going to take a little break for a word from our sponsor, and then let's come back and talk more about dirty laundry.
Lightsquare.com is a proud sponsor of PerfBytes. Lightsquare is a unique offering for performance tuning as a service for web architectures. Lightsquare delivers tuning recommendations in under 72 hours without the typical investment in tools, license fees, or consultants, where we do the work up front. With Lightsquare, you only pay based upon the level of improvement. Find out more about Lightsquare's unique pricing model at litesquare.com/pricing.
Speaking of dirty laundry, Andi, your latest and greatest blog post was based on some recent experience with a real customer. So maybe set the context with us where some of these first tips you have on a SharePoint health check, where do they come from?
Yeah, so we had well, actually, it's not only one customer, but over the recent years, we had several people approaching us, and I actually remember one story very vividly because I was really sorry for these guys. Yeah. It was an engineering shop from an Asian Pacific country. They had developers flying actually into Boston, our headquarters, and they did a workshop with me. And they said, "Hey, we've been working on this e-commerce solution for 2 years, and we did our first performance tests, and SharePoint doesn't scale." I said, "What do you mean with SharePoint? I thought you're talking about an e-commerce solution." Yeah, we built our e-commerce solution based on SharePoint." And I said, "Why?" "Well, because SharePoint gives us all these dynamic lists, and we can create a product category list like this, and you know, it's so flexible, and it was so great. But now with our first test, it just falls apart. Can you please help us to optimize it?"
Right.
Well, we looked at the whole thing, and then basically figured out that they were just let's say, I'm not sure what the right word is, but they were blindfolded. They thought it's great and flexible, but they didn't look behind the scenes.
They really didn't understand what was underneath.
They had no clue what's underneath, because underneath
rose-colored glasses.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like in the Valentine's Day today, they were in love with SharePoint. Exactly. They got the candy, but then they realized what was really in the package. So. The thing is, what they then learned, what I told them, is everything in the end ends up in a single table in the content database. That means if you have high transaction volume in your e-commerce store, then everything ends up in a single table, and it's all basically blocking each other out whenever you make updates. And this is just not going to scale.
So being this an e-commerce site, if I was doing a product lookup, it was all single-threaded doing the lookup, and if I had 15 or 20 people trying to do the lookup at the same time, it was contention?
So there's some caching in SharePoint, but I think it was mainly when the locking was the updates were the big problem. Because if you were basically issuing an order and buying something, the same table was locked where you have also all the product information in there. It's everything a single table. For the outside user, for the developer, it looks like, hey, I have a list and I can create another list and 5 different columns, and it's so cool and easy.
Yeah, just gotta nest them all together.
Yeah, it's awesome, it's everything in one single. It's a table, and I wrote blogs about it. So if you go to our blog and search for top 5 SharePoint performance problems, it's a table that has 65 columns, I believe, for each possible data type, like strings. It's interesting design.
So if you're deciding to design your e-commerce website that way, and you want about a 0.1% conversion rate, knock yourself out.
Exactly.
Knock yourself out. Go nice and slow. I think, Andi, to that point, I mean, if let's say somebody is implementing SharePoint and they start hearing this episode and they read your blog, they might go to their DBA staff with SQL Server and say, hey guys, we got this locking issue. What can we do? Mm-hmm. Well, an entry-level SQL Server DBA might say, well, let's just put no locks on everything.
Yeah.
And that will actually destroy and actually undermine all of SharePoint's capabilities to even maintain a referential integrity whatsoever. Yeah. So things will stop on each other and it'll blow. And suddenly you have total record corruption with these different lists. So, a lot of junior folks with locking issues will throw no locks at SQL Server, and that's not going to help. Yeah. But there were several other things outside of the dreaded single content database that you had found recently as well. So maybe we can talk a little bit about this thing you mentioned about app pools. Where does that come into play?
Well, app pools, folks that might not be so familiar with SharePoint. SharePoint is based on ASP.NET. So it's all a .NET based. It all runs on the .NET engine, hosted in IIS, and IIS hosts these applications in so-called app pools. So an app pool is nothing else than the worker process that runs, and then IIS is taking in the requests that come in from the browser, and then those that actually end up in SharePoint itself that is implemented in .NET, they are handled then by these app pools. And so I think what we see a lot is that depending on the load that you get on your SharePoint system, IIS takes the requests in, all the static and the dynamic ones, and then hands off the dynamic ones to the backend. Right. So we sometimes see improper sizing of the app pools, of the web gardening as they call it. Yeah. So you can there's a lot of things you can configure from a .NET perspective, and SharePoint is a .NET. It runs on the .NET platform. Mm-hmm. So doing a default installation, and that's not only true for Microsoft technologies. We also work a lot in the Java and PHP space. So any default installation is just doomed to fail if you just take the default installation and just think that works perfectly well for your production environment. So you always have to do the proper sizing of the worker pools, the proper sizing of the connection pooling, the proper sizing of remoting threads. So one instance that especially happens with web parts, if you add web parts to the mix, third-party web parts, and they make, let's say, web service calls or WCF calls, whatever technology framework they're using, to an external system, there are configuration settings where you can tell the .NET runtime how many threads are available for these calls. Yeah. And if you add the web part to the mix and you have no idea that these are actually making remoting calls, and you have a lot of loads, then you're basically locking each other out.
Yeah, I'm hearing a theme already here, Mark and Andy, with web parts. They seem to be able to wreak as much havoc as possible on your implementation.
Yeah, web parts are great because they allow SharePoint to be, let's say, more powerful, because you can add a lot of functionality to SharePoint that's not there by default. There's a lot of vendors out there, AvePoint, K2, Metalogics, Bamboo. There's a lot of vendors out there, and they build great web parts. But I think what people just forget, and this is true for anything in software engineering, if you are relying and bringing in a new framework or a new component, you need to use it and optimize it for your use case.
Yeah, for production volume.
And for production volume, well. Correct, yeah.
So, Andy, do you think that web parts have contributed to the decreasing utilization of SharePoint? They're wonderful, they're powerful, they're sexy, they look good, but they appear to wreak havoc on performance.
Yeah, I just 100% agree. That's what it is. Because, as you said, there's a lot of people that can put web parts on the marketplace. So there's a marketplace where you can download web parts, just as if you go with your. I know you like your Android. You mentioned that before.
And my phone. I'm all back on the other side. But I just can't give up my Android.
Yeah.
Phone.
So if you go to the Google Play Store, you have a full range of applications that you can download, and a lot of them are uploaded. They look nice in the beginning, but then if you use it, you actually figure out it's not what you need. Mm-hmm. Same is true for web parts, right? They look nice. It seems like they do the job well, but then if they perform poorly, and then eat up all your CPU, your memory, your RAM, your network, then you figure out that's not the right thing. And that adds to the frustration. And the thing is, the problem what I see, it's typically not the end. Well, sometimes the end users complain about it, but more so, end users just stop using SharePoint and just going to other services to get their job done.
Yeah.
That basically leads to the drop in I think, SharePoint adoption.
Now, let's keep in mind, web parts are not evil by nature, right?
They're not
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting they are, but I am suggesting is they take, if you're designing performance tests, if you have all these web parts in there, you really need to concentrate on what these are doing to your performance.
Exactly, and I think one step back actually. I think it's too late if you focus on these web parts in performance testing. I think as an architect, as a SharePoint architect,
Great point.
you need to, before you install anything like this, you need to do your sanity checks on these web parts.
And so, speaking of sanity checks, there's a few things that, Andi, in the blog entry, you actually suggest people start jumping through. One of them is monitoring with DynaTrace how the performance of the .NET framework or the CLR running with these app pools, and seeing, am I utilizing enough of do I give enough memory to the engine to run everything it needs to run? There's also meaning the number of threads. So if you throw more threads, you'll actually use more memory within that heap to do that. And then also, if you're chewing up the CPU, as you do more work and you open up more threads within the CLR, you'll scale up to chew up the CPU on the machine. So there's sort of a tuning step here in terms of .NET behind SharePoint. And I was going to say some web parts that have been around a while, the core ones within SharePoint themselves, they've done quite a good job of tuning them. So I would, if I were an architect, as you suggest, Andi, and here's this new sexy set of web parts we're going to get, and there's not that much, on the forums, or there's not much of a rating out there on these things that are unknown, then your risk goes up, and you should be doing some kind of a test to actually hammer those web parts with a tool like DynaTrace or diagnostics looking at that.
Exactly. Yeah, because DynaTrace basically, the sanity check that I always do is I look at the things like, what is the web part really doing? Is it making remoting calls? If so, how many, and does that change under more load? So does it actually scale well? Do they utilize caching? For instance, if I pound it with more load because I'm using a web part that is pulling in some data, does it, every time when I request the same web part, does it always go back to the database or to the remoting service and request the same data, or is it smart enough to cache certain static data? Right. This is things I do. How much data is actually loaded into memory? What's the memory footprint of these web parts? And then I tell people, please talk with the vendor and don't just be blind and foolish and think you can just take it as is, because typically there's a lot of configuration options that you have, how to optimize it. So these are the things I always check.
Yeah, I was going to say also, you've got the Ajax edition for the DynaTrace piece looking at the front end, which is, you should also look at that too. We've been talking mostly about the server side. And don't forget that people can build all sorts of crazy front end Ajax and or throwing Silverlight even in there, trying to see what's actually happening on the client. But I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into kind of your findings around other resources within the server. So particularly looking at storage, if we look at sort of the storage problems on a health check, what are the things you look at for SharePoint storage, disk and stuff like that?
So the first thing that I listed in the blog, so in the blog I always try to break it out between the different components like IIS, SQL Server, and SharePoint itself, like everything that runs in the .NET engine. So, and it's great that you mentioned the Ajax edition, or what I call web performance optimization. This should be hopefully a term that is not new to folks, but maybe we have some junior engineers on there. So web performance optimization is basically a movement that has been started years ago by Steve Souders, who is now working for Google. And he came up with the best practices on how to build efficient websites. And it starts with simple things like setting the proper cache settings on your images, on your JavaScript files, on your CSS files. Because if you don't put cache settings on there and the same visitor, the same end user opens the same page over and over again, you're forcing that browser to always download the same content, even though it never changes really. So you can cache it, and if it's cached, then you're actually taking away I/O burden or overhead on IIS. So that's something that you definitely want to do. Also, what I see a lot when people do sanity checks or performance checks, they like the features that IIS gives them of creating logs, so you can turn on log levels. And sometimes I just see people forget to turn off these logs after they're done with their sanity checks, or they take log settings that they get from their testing team or from the development team and just apply them to production. And there often you just log too much information. So really make sure that these settings are all production ready. And the other thing, I think I also mentioned modules. So IIS has the ability to use a lot of modules, like whether for authentication, for compression, different things. And here I remember 2 or 3 instances where custom URL rewrites modules have been used, and they were just blindly downloaded from GitHub or Stack Overflow or somewhere, and they were just not. They were a project of a software engineer who thought I will write my own URL rewrite module, but it was not scalable at all. So basically, spending 80% of the time in synchronization issues in these modules. So we make sure that everything that happens there in IIS is optimized.
Right.
From a SQL Server perspective, that's obviously SQL Server used to host the content database of Sharepoint. In the default installation, everything ends up on a single box, and sometimes people forget that once your Sharepoint installation grows, you may want to put them on dedicated servers. That's something that people typically forget. And I think also, Mark, you mentioned talk with your DBA. They typically have a very good understanding of SQL Server and how to do better deployments and how to optimize it.
Yeah, how about the basic thing of separating the physical volumes, your data files for the content database, from the log files?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's the physical I/O contention for storage that's typical in any SQL Server database implementation. It works just as well for a content database for SQL Server. And that's true. The other thing is definitely people testing a standalone SharePoint. And if in production it's going to be a shared SQL Server implementation, you kind of want to make sure that, hey, what's the noise? Am I really going to have a full-size database? Am I getting along with other applications that are hammering I/O? Are we separating out the physical files so we get rid of disk contention? And then, of course, having enough memory and connection infrastructure for SQL Server as well. So you have to open up obviously have connection pooling to the back end of the database as well.
Yeah.
And then within SharePoint, the engine itself, the CLR, there's also SharePoint-specific logging that you mentioned. And the same rules apply if they crank up the debug logging or run out of space and stuff like that.
Yeah, the thing is, sometimes, when you have a problem in production, then people start, turning debug logs on. And then, again, sometimes people simply just forget. It happens to everybody. But the thing is, it should not happen. But a lot of times, and you fill up your disks, and then, everything falls apart if you fill up your disks and there's no cleanup job. But in general, you're just using I/O that is not that needs to be used by somebody else, but not for your debug logging.
So from a CPU perspective, Andy, how resource intensive is SharePoint?
How resource intensive? Well, that really heavily depends on the web parts that you use. I think most of the stuff really, again, we're coming back to the same topic, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's. I've seen very bad implementations just in general, bad coding, requesting too much data, doing very stupid things in memory, like loading too much data in memory, then doing filtering of data and aggregation of data in memory instead of using the database, because that's where the database is good, right? Mm-hmm. Creating sums over thousands of tables, right? That's the database job and not something in memory.
Hey, didn't we talk about that in the last episode, Mark, about not using the right resource to do the right job?
Yeah, let's say you're going to bring back a huge data set and do a whole bunch of roll your own joins locally in the .NET CLR and SharePoint. That's ridiculous when SQL Server is highly efficient at doing things like joins and data set correlation. I think, Andy, in terms of talking about app pooling, we just to mention it again, if you've got high CPU, you're probably opened up too many threads. But there's that trade-off of if I reduce the number of threads, I may queue up some worker processing. So that this slows down the front end. So you're looking for that tuned balance that says, you know what, this is how we used to decide in the labs at Microsoft. You can run on 4 SharePoint servers versus you need 2 more to get enough concurrent usage and keep the response times. That is, if there's a bottleneck in that SharePoint app layer, in the app pool layer, then you would do that, sizing and tuning to make sure you've got enough threads across the entire farm of SharePoint servers for those app pools.
Yeah.
The other thing you mentioned in terms of CPU is watching out for whether it comes from a web part or other things running on the SharePoint server. If you're on a consolidated environment, there are other things that could chew up the CPU, and then your SharePoint processing becomes the victim, right?
Exactly, yeah. Because I think we said this in the beginning. Sometimes you just start with, hey, let's install the SharePoint instance. Yeah, here's a server. It's not heavy utilized, so just add it on that server, and then over time it becomes more popular. And then you figure out you share your precious resources with other processes. So yeah, definitely. One last thing I wanted to say on SharePoint CPU itself. Besides, loading too much data into memory, then the CPU is also consumed by the garbage collector because the more memory you use, it needs to be cleaned up. Another thing with web services, I see a lot of overhead actually in the serialization and deserialization of web service protocols. So if you're still on SOAP, then you have the whole overhead of the XML processing, the XML parsing. That's quite actually. I've seen cases where, SOAP itself, as nice as it is, but XML representations is, it's a certain size footprint, but also the parsing and the creation of that. So please be aware of how many web services you call and also what type of protocols you're really using in the formatting.
We just our last episode, we just talked about SOAP versus REST, and Howard went into detail about the
one other thing, just another thought. So Andy, when somebody's implementing, doing a SharePoint implementation, does SharePoint really lend itself to a virtualized environment, or are you better off installing on a physical dedicated machine?
Well, I think the answer is probably the same with any type of application, right? I mean, what we see a lot, there's two things we see. I think people try on the one side cram as many virtual images on the physical box, and then you are basically fighting for physical resources.
Exactly. Yeah. That's kind of where the question came up, listening to
but on the other side, we also see people that are just scared of the fact that their virtual environment is not properly sized and the edge is too much physical, so they're adding they have a lot of operational costs and actually not really good utilizing the virtual environment. So we see both areas, but in general, I think it's not a SharePoint related, not the SharePoint only topic. This is true for everything that you virtualize.
Absolutely.
Yeah. My own comment on that is as we consider some of the Forrester numbers you mentioned about 20+% are running using Office 365 and SharePoint hosted on Azure Cloud. You remember there are specialists that all they do is figure out how to get this stuff to run optimally across thousands of servers in a hosted shared environment. If you don't have those kinds of super virtualization skills in your own team, then you're going to be hard-pressed to figure out how to get SharePoint to scale across a virtualized system. No matter what the cost ROI looks like for consolidating and virtualizing, it's always better to test it and tune it to make sure it does work optimally. Because the answer is never that you can't do it. It's just if you're going to go down that path with any application, to your point, Andy, you've got some overhead to make sure that you've configured it properly and the virtual farm of servers are actually configured to do that. We'll take just a short little break here for a public service announcement. We have no idea what it'll be about, but it'll go right here. And then we'll come back.
I'm going to we should put my new commercial in there, if you like it.
Hi, honey. I'm home.
Hey, you don't sound too good. What's up?
Yeah, not 100% today. My boss says I'm not performing at my peak today.
Not performing at your peak? Feeling like you're a website that crashes on a daily basis? Perhaps you need to tune your system up in the morning with a hearty breakfast. The best way to tune your system is to start the morning off with a heaping helping of PerfBytes cereal. PerfBytes is the cereal for the adult on the go. PerfBytes are a little bit of performance goodness with the flavor of a wonderful single malt scotch that will get you up and running to start your day. PerfBytes contains 100% of your daily FDA nutritional requirements. Plus, it packs the punch of a single malt to make your day even more enjoyable. Just add some ice and woohoo, you're ready to go. Heck, even if you're having a sluggish day after the first bowl of PerfBytes, just have a couple of extra bowls and you won't care about the rest of your day anyway.
Hi, honey. I'm home.
Did you have a better day today?
Heck yeah. Give me another bowl of those PerfBytes.
PerfBytes, the official cereal of Mark and James. And if you're a teetotaler like Howard, try the new PerfBytes Light. All the flavor of our original PerfBytes cereal without the potential for the slurred speech. Caution, PerfBytes are not for anyone under 21 years of age. After eating PerfBytes in the morning, it is recommended that you either take the bus, take the train, or let someone else drive you to work. And remember, start your morning off with that delicious, nutritious cereal called PerfBytes.
So near and dear to Howard and I in performance on network, there's also some things you cover in the blog, Andi, about network utilization in the Sharepoint world. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we mentioned it briefly before from an iOS perspective, so from the web server's perspective. If you are following the best practices on web performance optimization, like doing, or utilizing cache headers properly, optimizing your JavaScript, your images, I have countless examples on my blog on really, let's say, bad mistakes in web performance optimization, too large images and all that stuff. So that just eats up a lot of network bandwidth to your IIS. Also reiterating basically SharePoint itself. You want to analyze the connection between SharePoint and the database, the content database. Typically here you see SharePoint is just, fetching too much data that is actually not needed and then filtered in memory, just as we said before. And also these external calls that you make to other web services. And here, I think before the break, we talked about hosting the whole thing in a virtualized environment, maybe in the cloud. If you host this in the cloud service, and you're in the cloud service, you pay for network traffic.
Oh, yeah.
You add a web part that is reaching out to an external web service somewhere. Mm-hmm. And this web part is doing stupid things like requesting too much data by web service. You are paying not only the cost for the web part, but additional operational cost for the network bandwidth that consumes.
Well, it's just not the bandwidth. It's going to be late, where am I accessing my server from, right?
Exactly.
Which kind of brought me a quick question to me. Is there content that could be cached? And have you seen people implement this through a CDN? Like if it's going to be sort of like worldwide, US-wide, whatever.
So the CDN obviously works well for the front-end part, right?
Absolutely.
But for the web services that are called on the SharePoint server side that make backend web service calls, there is no option to use a CDN.
Absolutely.
For that, you need local cache. You need the web parts need to cache data, or just be smarter with requesting the data. Yeah. So, but that's kind of coming back to the initial thought. If you are a SharePoint administrator, before you put something in production, before you put a web part in production, do your sanity check and figure out what these web parts are really doing. Yeah. How much data do they access from a database perspective, but also web service perspective, and how does it scale under load? Does it utilize any caching, or is it always requesting the same data? These are things that you definitely want to do.
I just think it's really interesting when we switch from CapEx to OpEx using the cloud as a service for IT. It's really interesting how performance generally is when you translate, if bad performance in a CapEx where you're buying software, implementing whatever, it's almost seen like it's all a one-time expense. We tune it up once and then we run with it. And we maybe do some capacity projection every now and then. And then we said, let's monitor that capital expense to build the hardware and the software and the configuration to do it. And so as we move to the cloud, poorer performance makes your OpEx go nuts. As you point out, you have, Howard, it's if you have a bad performing web part that sucks a bunch of data across the wire, not only are you getting poor performance, but the direct cost impact to the bottom line of that operational expense comes right back at you. Not only is it poor performance, but I'm paying more to be worse in terms of response time.
Exactly, right. And kind of as we talked about last week, if you're not actually tuning the way you're getting your data across the wire, it's just going to exacerbate the whole situation, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there are a couple other health checks, Andi, that you refer to, and maybe we can just summarize them. We don't want to give away the whole blog part, but it was mostly around an IIS health check and a component health check. Yeah. And what are kind of the three things that you talk about here for IIS?
So for IIS, I was talking about the average page response size. So if you are a SharePoint administrator, check out what's the average footprint of your page. If you're deploying a new version of SharePoint, if you're deploying new sites, and if this number goes significantly up, you made a mistake, and then just follow the general web performance sanity checks.
Yeah. So this isn't really anything different than what you do with any normal web page, right? You always want to understand what the footprint of your web.
Exactly. The only challenge here is, right, if you have third-party web parts and you are and coming back to the same thing, and you hit the update button because there's a new version available, then it's actually something that you may get in through the back door. Yeah. Like, now your pages are like twice as heavy as before. So
not to mention that a lot of people in IT assume SharePoint is not like any other web architecture. They're like, well, it's SharePoint. Microsoft already did all the tuning. It's not like normal IIS ASP.NET apps where we have to do all the work on our code that we tuned up. They assume it's SharePoint. It should scale. We don't have to do this extra work. But the truth is, you do from a configuration capacity.
And especially Sharepoint makes it so easy for everybody to create new pages, new lists. So you can do a lot of dynamic things, right? You can create a lot of things very easily. So you really need to have a live monitor, a production monitor that checks the size. Other health check, I always look at thread utilization. So making sure that your IIS farm is properly sized, that you have enough worker threads, both on the IIS side, but also on ASP.NET. And there's these metrics that you should look at. I mean, this is basic queuing theory. It's all about queues and pools that you want to make sure you have plenty and enough. But not only if you see a problem with these threads, your first action, obviously short term, will be to increase them. But the long term strategy must be to figure out why they are no longer enough. Yeah. And typically it's something in the back end that your worker threads are just consumed by too much unnecessary I/O or CPU or memory.
I think also, Andy, people should keep in mind as they're moving clearly from 2007, 2010 to the newer versions. With IIS, there were changes to classic pipelines and configuration. If you're still running old web parts or old SharePoint that require that classic IIS pipeline, there's also a performance overhead with running both on the same server. In terms of those IIS configurations.
Yeah. And then in general, to kind of round up the IIS side, bandwidth requirement, the overall bandwidth requirement, what do you need from an outbound network pipe perspective? Can we, if you host it on premise, obviously you need to make sure that your pipes are big enough. If you host it in the cloud, you want to figure out what that costs actually.
Yeah, and you might need a web accelerator if you're deploying SharePoint clients to small sites on a small pipe around the world or something like that.
I was just kind of curious, is SharePoint inherently a bandwidth hog?
I think it is. Even the default things I saw in 2010, there were simple things like an image pixel. Actually, you remember John Wishon and I did that gig. We found a simple little icon map pixel that was being sent for an icon, which who cares about the resolution on an icon? It's an icon map that was like 250K. And of course, on a slow link to a remote site, and it wasn't cached. So acceleration, not only did we reduce the size of that individual image down to like 20K, but of course it's an icon, so it looked the same. It looked totally fine. But yeah, there were simple optimizations for the out of the box back in 2010 that can help anything across a slow link or a WAN implementation. And we in that gig, I think it was Cisco WAS that helped tremendously meeting all of their goals.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of WAN accelerators anyways, but we can do that in a different show.
Yeah, and then remember SharePoint in its original intention document sharing, right? And if you have large documents, then... So this is kind of rounds it up from an IIS perspective. Then going into component health check, here I really talk about memory usage and garbage collection impact, because again, coming back to the same old topic, if we have web parts that load too much data into memory, if they make web service calls using SOAP versus REST and have all the footprint of it, the memory footprint, then you will see high memory utilization, meaning it results to high garbage collection, which also eats up your CPU. Right. This is very, very important.
I remember in the older days, especially with ASP.NET, Andy, we looked at something that was, anything over 20-25% garbage time spent in GC, you were definitely abusing something.
Yeah, correct.
Is that still hold true generally for the CLR?
I think so. I think that still holds true, and it basically means that you are just... if you have a high object churn rate, I think that's the technical term for it. That means you have a lot of objects being created for a short time and then being being basically disposed soon again, that the garbage collector is constantly working. That means you're just loading too much memory for short term. And yeah, but the 20%, I would say, I guess it depends still on the application a little bit, but 20% seems actually on the higher side already.
Yeah. I also think as people tune up web parts and get Sharepoint working, some web parts out there that aren't tuned properly, they may attach themselves. Look for your promotions into old gen GC and things that say they still attach to the session object, or they try to maintain a data structure for the long term to try to reduce round trips to the content database.
Yeah,
and those things might not get cleaned up by GC. So your high memory state may be older objects that get promoted, and they're also the slowest objects within the CLR. They're not getting cleaned up properly, and you might end up with so many old gen sessions that on a huge session log out, say at the end of the workday, you could end up with some real stop the world situations happening.
Yeah, I typically do. So DynaTrace, we also provide a full memory heap dump analysis.
Yeah.
Just take a heap dump and then figure out, like, do it maybe every other hour, take a heap dump, but then see which objects are actually growing on the heap, and then you'll figure it out. I mean, there's obviously also a trade-off. Before, I was talking about some web parts should actually utilize caching, and caching means you cache it in memory, right? So they end up in the old generation.
Now, also, I would say when you're looking at certain pages being slow, it could be things that are loading and using these dynamic lists in a content database. And it makes me think in DynaTrace, I'd also want to look at sort of the database, the connection time, and see if there's things backing up in terms of database time, or excessive calls back into a whole bunch of lists in that content database.
Exactly. And that's actually great that you bring it up. So this was kind of my initial blog series I did like 3-4 years ago, the excessive abuse of querying data from the content database, using the SP list, the SP view, SP query APIs of Sharepoint. But if you're not using it in the right way, you'll be shocked on what's actually going on.
So what were some of the consequences when you saw that happening?
Well, the consequences, the thing is there's a lot of actually easy fixes for it. That was an interesting thing. So I saw a lot of developers taking sample applications, how to iterate, for instance, through lists in Sharepoint. And there's always the same example, like the for loop and then going through it. But some of these examples were not utilizing the API correctly. So every time you go through a loop, you actually always, in every loop iteration, internally request the whole content database into memory. And I have blog posts on it, and it is shocking, and it's kind of hilarious when you look at it as well. But these things end up in real production environments, and there's typically a lot of easy fixes for it, because I'm not want to bash all the time about the API or Sharepoint, because there are ways how you can tell the Sharepoint API, please only give me these 5 elements that I need, and instead of querying everything into memory and then doing the filtering in memory.
Yeah, I mean, you can't bash the tool all the time. You have to bash the people who are using the tool, right?
Exactly, yeah. They're using it blindly. I always call this blindly reusing components, right? It's great to use components that are there, but if you blindly do it without looking behind the scenes, then you can end up in a very bad situation.
It's kind of like driving blindfolded or something, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so like when you leave the driveway, maybe I'll blindfold you and see if you can get
exactly.
Not to belabor the point on web parts, but I do like this phrase that actually I just read this, and you, Andy, you referred to it as web parts gone wild.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think that sums up everything we've ranted about web parts on the show.
Yeah.
Well, I had one more question on web parts.
Yeah.
Could you dynamically load a web part? I mean, do they always when you load the page, do they automatically always load? Is there a way to just not call a web part until you actually need to use it?
No, with a web part, so if you design a Sharepoint page, you basically say, hey, on the top left, I want to have this web part. On the top right, I want to have this web part. So when you actually execute on that HTML request, that web request, then Sharepoint on the server side will load the web part. And then it's like a web control. It's like if you have ever, it's like an ASP.NET control. So it will be loaded.
Now, there are some options you have, Howard, when it comes to web parts, because you have sort of the administrator level page, the defaults, and what you might, there are, depending on the web part, if you load like a portal page and certain web parts that are heavier, you actually do them in a minimized or collapsed kind of menu bar. So the part is actually minimized. You can actually reduce depending on the web part, you might be able to reduce that web part doesn't load the whole component in the page from the client. You may still incur some hit to the server, especially if they're doing sort of reverse JavaScript or loading something through into the app pool when the page gets instantiated. Whether it's open or closed as a web part may have a benefit as the default. Now, again, most users, it has a thing where once you get your page set up the way you like it, your view, you can save that view as your default, and users can go and make it heavier. But yeah, that's something that is fully controlled, and I guess through ASP.NET that can be actually relayed and wiped out from a cached view state to reset the default for certain web parts. But this could be a common technique when rolling out new web parts on standardized pages, where you can actually shut down the controls on the user session and say, you know what, this web part is always collapsed by default and doesn't actually load the full component until it gets expanded by the user. But that's not true for every web part to obey the status of their component.
What I say, Mark, is why do the heavy lifting? Why do the heavy lifting if you don't need to at that point in time, right?
Yeah, I agree. So, Andi, this is really awesome. I just want to share, from your perspective, are there any closing thoughts on our conversation, helping people to get started with SharePoint performance?
Well, the closing thoughts are, I think you do not only rely on the standard way you're monitoring performance right now. Do not only look at CPU, memory, and disk utilization if you see they are overutilized and add more hardware to it, but really look behind the scenes. Look, why are you maxing out CPU, memory, and disk? Because, and coming back to our most favorite topic, web parts gone wild, it's most likely some of the web parts that you added to your mix. Or what it could also be, don't be blind enough, don't be foolish to just do a default deployment of SharePoint and then assume this will just scale on its own.
Yeah, even though these could be, it's a third party, it's a vendor, you can use tools, diagnostics tools and profilers like DynaTrace or others to look in underneath the covers and actually find out what's doing all these issues.
Exactly, and it's easy to do, right? It's easy to do these sanity checks, and but yeah, please focus on. Don't go with the default. Look behind the scenes. Look what you're adding to your system. SharePoint, and also don't think SharePoint is the lifesaver. It can do everything. It was like, remember the story from this e-commerce implementation. Yeah. That's not what SharePoint was meant to be used for.
Yeah, exactly. Howard, what are you thinking with our discussion today?
Well, first I want to thank Andi for joining us. I think this was awesome, and personally, I've just learned so much more about SharePoint than I ever knew before. My only experience in testing a SharePoint site was a few years back, and we were just doing some network profiling as they were doing an upgrade, and they wanted to make sure that response times were adequate over the web between one version to the next. My one big takeaway are web parts. I think these things can just wreak havoc on your implementation. And I love the fact that Andi mentioned that, if you're not understanding what they're going to do in your architecture phase, then you're really going to be in trouble. So again, to all you performance engineers out there, you really, really need to understand what's going on in your implementation, buddy up with your system architect, and go from there.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me, Andi, and I like your approach in these series of blog entries where SharePoint is not one thing. It's actually a collection of different large components, not web part components. It's got a web server, it's got an app server, it's got a database. Grew up out of a 3-tier web architecture. There are best practices or good practices for SQL Server that are not the defaults for a lot of SharePoint, especially 2010. There's a lot of things happening on the front end in IIS. I think my biggest advice or biggest thing in closing is to encourage people to learn each of the different large parts, the web tier, the app tier, and the database tier in SharePoint, and look at them individually for optimal configuration, sizing, memory usage, and all of that kind of stuff. But that's, and then of course, Howard, web parts gone wild. I agree. Andi, thanks so much for joining us. Maybe you can share a little bit with the audience about how to get connected with you and find out more from DynaTrace. And I think the biggest win here for everyone in the PerfBytes world is to find out more about the APM blog. the blog at dynatrace.com.
Exactly. And I think if you search for Sharepoint there, you will find my recent blog series, which started with the Sharepoint system performance check beyond CPU memory. There's also the top 5 Sharepoint performance mistakes.
Yeah.
There's the 15-minute Sharepoint sanity check. And that also actually includes a link to the YouTube video I mentioned before. Yeah. Folks that are on Twitter, follow me at Grabner Andi and or DynaTrace at DynaTrace. I will also be at STPCon. Mark, I think I will see you there, right? Later.
Yes.
Actually, I have a performance clinic, which I want to mention here as well.
Yeah, and this is you and I did a clinic together in Denver, but this is something that DynaTrace has been doing with customers all over the place.
Yeah, not only customers. So I actually am responsible for the DynaTrace free trial. So you can download the free trial. Right. So anybody can do it. You don't have to buy the product. Yeah. And I think we three guys, we are really lucky that we've been working in performance for a long, long time. So I guess we can all consider ourselves performance experts. Sure. A lot of folks out there that struggle with performance are not in that lucky situation. They just have to deal with it when the hits the fan, as they call it. I hope I'm allowed to use that word here.
No, we bleep it out. It's way more funny.
Okay. And so basically what I'm offering is I'm offering both online but also offline or on-site performance clinics. That means the idea is I'll share my steps on how I do sanity checks on applications, both front-end, back-end, and also deployment problems. And the idea with these clinics, especially at SDPCon now, is bring your own application, BYOA. So bring your performance patient, and I am the performance doctor.
Dr. Grabner.
Exactly. Dr. Grabner is looking at your performance and make sure you don't need the blue pill, but we just solve it. We solve it with natural ingredients. Maybe add some bacon on it, because bacon saves the world, kind of. So yeah, I'm doing this performance clinic on Sunday the 29th. Starting at 2 p.m. and then it depends how long people want to stick around. Yeah. But the idea is bring your own application, bring your own DynaTrace data, and we'll have a look at it, and then I'll give you feedback on what I think is wrong with your app.
Oh, I love that.
So folks that want to just jump in, they can go get the DynaTrace free trial. Yeah. And is there a URL that we can post for that?
Yeah, there's a bit.ly/DT trial, or you can also Google for DynaTrace trial. So you register there, then you get an email. Please also look in your spam folder.
So you could install this on your Sharepoint server. It would connect into the .NET CLR. You could actually export then the DT session, or at least pull out a peer path. Yeah. And you get that peer path. You can bring it to the clinic. And actually, you could get myself or Andi to start diagnosing what's happening within this. So it's a wonderful dig deep and really learn. Not only do you learn DynaTrace, but obviously you learn how to fix your application, which is pretty cool.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now you have maybe a couple other clinics coming up.
Yeah. So I do one every other week online. So it's on bit.ly/online perf clinic. But I also do some of them, as I said, offline or on site. Then we plan one in Boston later in the spring, hopefully when after all the snow is gone, which may take until June. I don't know. It really depends because another storm coming in. But there is on the DynaTrace community portal. So if you go to community.dynatrace.com, there's an events tab that lists all the conferences, the user group, the meetups, and also these clinics. So please check it out.
Cool. That sounds really, really cool. And we give our special thanks out to your colleagues at DynaTrace for doing such a great job of keeping all these. There's a lot of resources there to dig in, and we appreciate it. Well, PerfBytes listeners, once again, you've come to the close of another deeply diagnosed .NET CLR episode of the PerfBytes show. And we'd always, as always, we'd like to thank you for listening to the PerfBytes engineering world, for taking the time to listen. And of course, on behalf of James, who was technically unable to join us today, I will say thank you to James's mom for tuning in, because then, we know we always have at least one person listening, which is awesome.
Well, I'd like to say thanks to Hallmark for making Valentine's cards, because after 30 years of marriage, I need a card to remind me that I love my wife. Thank you, dear. I love you. Happy Valentine's Day. And also thanks to the dogs for actually sleeping through the recording.
No, that's yes, very good. Andi?
Well, yeah, I want to say thank you to my awesome roommate, Stefan, here in Boston, because he was nice enough to lend me his car to come to join this episode at Howard's place and enjoy the bacon and the pancakes.
Wow.
Oh, that's bacon and pancakes would be really good. And as always, I will give my special thanks out to Martha, the sexy Irish voice of PerfBytes, and also a special thanks to our sponsors, SmartBear and Sosta, for their sponsorship and support of the PerfBytes community. A shout out to DynaTrace, of course, Andi, for you guys coming on the show and actually supporting us. That's also awesome.
Today's show is powered by Spectre, special executives for counterintelligence, terrorism, revenge, and extortion, led by Blofeld in their extensive investment in scalable Sharepoint collaboration solutions supporting field operations.
Yeah, and please remember that all the content of this PerfByte episode is copyrighted and protected by Butcher Quality Bacon, similar to the way that bacon protects our bodies from the freezing cold and snow and allows us to survive brutal winters in the Northland.
And of course, for more information about PerfBytes, you can visit the show's website at www.perfbytes.com or follow us on the Twitter, the Facebook, and of course, you can always subscribe and listen to the PerfBytes podcast on iHeartRadio, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Stitcher, and testingpodcast.com. Just open your favorite listening app and search for the PerfBytes show and click the subscribe button or the favorites button or whatever button you have there. That would be fine.
The PerfBytes show and staff are supporters of the Practical Performance Analyst, the Performance Engineering Book of Knowledge, the Computer Measurement Group, the Workshop on Performance and Reliability, and of course the Software Test Professionals community of software testers. We hope to see you at the next STPCon conference in April of 2015 in San Diego. Check out more at www.stpcon.com.
As the folks here in the Northeast prepare for yet another winter storm, Neptune blast, remember to email your questions and comments to ask@perfbytes.com. Once again, we may just do a show based on your request, just like episode 54 for our loyal PerfBytes listener, Sandeep. Have a great week, everyone. We are out of here to go shovel more snow.
Have a great week, everybody. Thanks again, Andi. We'll see you soon.
Hi, thank you.